B'siyata d'shmai, we're going to learn sukkah Daf Yotes. We're going to start from the middle of the Amud, approximately second word of a line after the two dots. Tana, we learned in a Tosefta. And we've already mentioned this on Daf Yudalad Amud base. The Gemara briefly mentioned this. Psal hayoytza min sukkah nidoin k'sukkah. A few simple words in the Brisa. Psal, which we've known is the term used for kosher schach. And let's assume there's long reeds that are used on the schach, long poles on the schach for kosher schach. The reason it's called psal is because it's the term of psoiles goyr and v'yekev, as we've learnt. Hayetza min sukkah, it protrudes from the sukkah. Nidon k'sukkah has the same halacha as the sukkah. And it's very cryptic, we don't really know what this means. The Gemara is going to have a whole list of different explanations what halachas, what this could mean. My psal hayetza min sukkah, the Gemara asks, what is this psal? Kosher schach that protrudes from a sukkah that has the status of a kosher sukkah. Oma Ula, the first explanation is that of Ula, konim hayotzim la'achorei sukkah. Let's assume a sukkah's typically got 3 walls, it could even have 4 walls, and behind the sukkah, which means beyond the wall of the sukkah, is protruding some of the schach, is sticking out behind the sukkah. That's called psal. It's kosher schach hayotzim min sukkah. It's protruding outside the sukkah. Says the Gemara, if it's just if it's just schach sticking out over the back of the sukkah, do you not need to have 3 walls there? Does a sukkah not need to have 3 walls at least? As we've learned, at least shtayim kelchoson or shlishis afilu tefach. You can't just have no walls. Well, there is one wall there, the back wall of the sukkah, but you can't just have schach sticking out with no other walls and it'll be kosher. Says the Gemara, b'de'ika, the walls, there are walls there, which means that I have the sukkah that I'm in, that I built. Behind the sukkah, the schach sticking out, and the walls are also sticking out. Well, but you know, sukkah. But it's not good enough just to have a little bit of wall. It needs to be 7 by 7 tefachim. B'de'ika, we're talking about that the 7 by 7 tefachim of schach with the required walls. In a desperate attempt to understand what's the chiddush here, maybe the Gemara thought that the psal, the schach sticking out, is just a very little bit, weak bit of schach, and it's offering more sunlight than shade. There isn't a majority of shade from this schach, and that's not sufficient. We need that there should be more shade than sun. Says the Gemara, b'de'ika, there is. So now the Gemara says, if so, what's the Brisa coming to teach us? You've got the back of the sukkah, you've got 3 walls, you've got schach, the schach is kosher, the schach is giving enough shade. So what's the chiddush? Of course it's nidin k'sukkah, of course it's kosher. Says the Gemara, no. I may have thought, since the back wall was originally positioned to serve the inside of the main sukkah, not to serve the back, and even the walls that continued from the back, when they were first made, they were made to serve the main sukkah. It was only afterwards that the back wall was put on, and then what was sticking out no longer became necessary for the inside sukkah and was serving the outer sukkah. It was not made to serve the outside sukkah. So I may have thought those walls are not kosher to serve the sukkah. I may have thought it's not kosher. Kumash Malon says Ula, that is the chiddush of the Brisa, that it's kosher. That is how Rashi learns this Gemara. Tosfos learns that Hoyel Ulagavoy Avida means it's not because of the walls, it's the schach. Since the schach was first put there to serve the inner sukkah and it's just sticking out, I may have thought that such schach cannot serve a different area, and the chiddush of Ula, or Ula explains the chiddush of the Brisa, is that it suffices. That was the first explanation, that was Ula. Rabba and Rabbi Yosef Amr Tarvayu, Rabba and Rabbi Yosef both offer a different explanation to the Brisa. What does it mean, psal hayotzim min sukkah nidoin k'sukkah? Hocha bekonim hayotzim lifnim min sukkah, which means if I've got a 3-walled sukkah and the open wall, the front of the sukkah which is open, there are some reeds sticking out beyond there from the front of the sukkah, not behind the back wall, but in front of the front entrance. And one of the walls of the sukkah actually protrude beyond the area of the other wall. It's longer than the wall opposite it, and is following and going out the same length as the schach, which means I've got schach sticking out, but under that schach, I've only got the one wall, and the middle wall, the facing wall, the back wall. And this should be a typical sukkah of shtayim kilchosa or shlishis afilu tefach. We don't need the two walls to be as long as each other. So what would be the chiddush here? I may have thought holes bo hechsher sukkah. I may have thought that since you haven't got a 7 by 7 tefachim area in this area sticking out, I may have thought it's not good enough. And Rashi explains here. Rashi says that the very fact that one wall is longer but the other wall is shorter, that more or less is a statement saying that this is a sukkah on its own right. It's an independent sukkah. Why didn't you make both walls the same length? It must mean that the original sukkah is only up to the length of the shorter wall. In which case, the new area in front of the sukkah only has that one wall and doesn't have the hechsher sukkah. And we need to have 7 tefachim with a hechsher sukkah. It's kumash malon. That's what the Bryce is coming to teach us, says Rabbi and Rav Yosef, that no, it's kosher and you can sit under this area of the sukkah. Continues the Gemara. Rabbi Bar Bar Chona Omar Rabbi Yochanan. Another explanation. We're not talking about something protruding from a sukkah. We're talking about different patches and areas within the sukkah. You've got most of the sukkah, the schach is offering more shade than sunlight. But a minority of the sukkah has too much sunlight, has more sunlight than shade. I may have thought Tiposil bahach purta. I may have thought that little bit, that minority of the sukkah, where there is not tzilos amruba mechamasa, is considered a posel sukkah. Komash malon. That's what the Bryce is coming to tell us, that it's kosher. That's called psal ayotza min sukkah. It's a little bit of schach, which is indeed chamasa meruba mitzalosa. It's not enough shade, and it's protruding from the areas around it, which are tzilos meruba mechamasa. And the Bryce says it's kosher. Uma yotza, when it says psal hayotza min sukkah, which seems to be that the schach which is coming out of the sukkah, here it's not out of the sukkah, it's in the sukkah. It means yotza mehechsha sukkah. It doesn't mean it's out of the area of sukkah. It means it's out, it's infringed beyond the halachic requirements of a sukkah. A sukkah requires a majority of shade, and in this area of the sukkah has gone out of those boundaries and is not got enough shade. That's called psal hayotza min sukkah. And nonetheless, the chiddush is, it's kosher. Continues the Gemara, another explanation, fourth explanation, Rabbi Oishia Omar, Lo nitzar cho'elo l'schach posel, pochos mishloisha b'sukkah ktana. If you've got a very small sukkah, it's 7 by 7 tefachim, and you've got 2 tefachim of schach posel there. So I may have thought that you need 7 tefachim of schach kosher, and you don't have it. So I may have thought that the sukkah is posel. That's what it says. Psal hayotza min sukkah nidoin kasukkah. That the sukkah is kosher. Umay yotza. What does it mean that it's coming out of the sukkah? It means yotza mitoira sukkah. Again, as we saw before, that these 2 tefachim, for example, is less than 3 tefachim, is outside. It's infringed beyond the halachic requirements of a sukkah. A sukkah requires schach kosher. Here you've got posel schach. So I may have thought that, and that's what it means, it's yotza min sukkah. It's not within the halachic requirements of sukkah. I may have thought that the sukkah is posel. Kumash malon, that it's not posel. That's what the Bryce is telling us, that since it's less than 3 tvachim of schach posel, even though you do not have a full 7 tvachim of schach kosher, it combines with the schach kosher, and it's as if the whole sukkah has schach kosher, and the sukkah is a kosher sukkah. Asks the Gemara, Maskif lo Rav Hoshia. Rav Hoshia is now asking against Rav Oishia. Rav Oishia said that the chiddush of the Brisa is that less than 3 tvachim of schach posel does not passel even a minimum size sukkah. He says, what's the chiddush? Lo yehe elo avir. Let it be no worse than airspace. Va'avir pochis mishleisha tvachim. Everybody knows that airspace less than 3 tvachim, b'sukkah ktan in a very small sukkah, mi posel. Is it posel? It's not posel. So why would I need a brisa to tell us that schach posel less than 3 tvachim, the sukkah is still kosher? If it just wouldn't be there, if it would just be air, it would also be kosher. What's the chiddush of the brisa? Omar le Rav Abba. So Rav Abba answered to Rav Hoshia to answer what Rav Hoshia said, that zeh mitztarif v'yashenim tachtov. There's a fundamental difference. With schach posel, you're actually allowed to, not only is these, let's call it 2 tvachim, the less than 3 tvachim of schach posel, not only does it combine with the schach kosher to be called a kosher sukkah, as if it's got 7 by 7 of schach kosher, v'yeshenim tachtov, you're even allowed to sleep under it. However, v'zer, but when it comes to the airspace, mitztarif, indeed, if you have 2 tfachim, or less than 3 tfachim of airspace, a strip of airspace in a small sukkah, it's true that the sukkah is kosher, v'ein yeshenim tachtov, but you're not allowed to sleep under that airspace. So I may have thought that schach posel is the same as air, as avir, and you're not allowed to sleep underneath it. The Brisa says no. Psala yotzim in a sukkah, nida in sukkah. It's got all the halachas of sukkah. You can even sleep underneath it. Asks the Gemara, umik ikamidi de itztarufei mitzdarif v'hu atzmei eina kosher. You mentioned that regarding the airspace in a small amount of airspace in a very small sukkah, the sukkah is still kosher because it's a very small amount of airspace, but you're not allowed to sleep under the sukkah. Where do you find such a thing that it combines to make the sukkah kosher, but you cannot live under it as if it's a kosher sukkah? Where do you find such a concept? Rabbi Yitzchok ben Eliashiv, yes, I'll give you an example. Tit hanoroik, which is a type of mud, Yechiach, that will prove it. In the halachas of a mikveh, that if you have a mikveh of 40 sar, and part of that 40 sar is this, it's a very liquidy type of mud, and if part of this 40 sar is mud, then it's mitzdarif to the 40 sar. V'atoivel boy le'olsolei tefillah. However, if you toivel inside the mikveh of 40 sar, if you toivel in the muddy part of the 40 sar, you haven't been yotza the tefillah. You're not yotza. However, this mud does add up to be included in the 40 sar. So you see it's combined to make up a mikveh, but you cannot go into it as if it's a mikveh. That's how we're supposed to understand this Gemara. That's how Tosafos explains it. Rashi says a few extra words, which Tosafos has an issue with, but that's how Tosafos explains this. Continues the next Mishnah. Ha'oyiseh sukkosoi kamin tzrif. If somebody makes a sukkah like a hut, it comes to a point at the top, and there's no roof. Normally we know a sukkah has to have walls, and a sukkah has to have a roof, a schach. Over here, it's just the walls slanting up and meeting each other at a point. You haven't got a roof there. Or you take some reeds or some long branches and you lean them against a wall, and one end of these branches are on the floor, the other one is touching the wall, and again, so you've got the same wall which is serving also as a wall, also as the roof. It's kosher schach, so we don't have an issue with that. But Rabbi Eliezer says it's posel. Because a sukkah has to have a roof. It doesn't have a roof, it's just got a slanty wall. The Chachomim say it's kosher. Says the Gemara, Tana, we learned in a Brisa, Tosefta, Moide Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer, who says over here that it's posel, he says, She'imikbiya mina karka tefach. If you lift up this tzrif, either the tzrif or the samcha l'kaisel, either way, in either case, if you lift it off the tefach, you have an upright of a full tefach upright before the slanty part, or the slanty part does not reach the wall. For example, in the case of the wall, if it's away from the wall, a tefach, it's slanting from the floor up, and then you have one tefach horizontal on top of it. In that case, even Rabbi Eliezer will agree that sheikh sheira, it's kosher, because you have a clearly defined section which is the wall part, even though one tefach is enough for that. It's an oihel, it's one tefach up, the rest can be considered roof. Or you've got the whole thing going up and one tefach roof at the top. Says the Gemara, what would be the reasoning, the source for the Rabbanon to say that even when you don't have a clearly defined wall and roof, it's still kosher? The Rabbanon hold, this is a Gemara, we learned this in Shabbos, that when you have a slanty type of a tent, the whole thing is considered an oihel, a tent, even though you cannot tell clearly where the wall is, where the roof is, it's considered an oihel. Continues the Gemara. Abaye ashke cheder of Yosef. Abaye met Rav Yosef to Kogoni that was sleeping bekilas chasanim in a bridal canopy, besukkah in the sukkah, and these canopies had draped over them a sheet which would be posel schach, and it was one of these canopies, we learnt about it earlier on, where you have a single post over the middle of the bed and the canopy is draped over it. You don't have a tefach wide on top, and therefore Rav Yosef obviously hold there's no problem you're allowed to sleep in it. It's not considered as if I'm not in the sukkah. It's not considered as if I'm in a different oyhel. No, this is not considered an oyhel. Something that doesn't have clearly defined vertical walls and horizontal roof is not considered an oyhel. So it's as if he's in the sukkah. No problem. Omerli. So Abaye said to Rav Yosef, Kaman ka Rabbi Eliezer, are you following Rabbi Eliezer? Shavkas Rabbanon, you've left the opinion of the Rabbanon, v'avdas ka Rabbi Eliezer, because in our Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer is the one that says that you need to have a roof. The Rabbanon say, Shipuei holim kaholim dami. The Rabbanon say, even when you don't have a clearly defined roof, it's still considered an oyhel. So according to the Rabbanon, then there should be an issue to sleep in a kilas chasanim in a sukkah. Omerli. So Rav Yosef answered back to Abaye, Braisa ipchatoni. In a Braisa, the opinions were the other way around. Rabbi Eliezer machshir. Rabbi Eliezer is the one that said it was kosher. Rabbi Eliezer is the one that says shipuei holim keholim domi. The chachomim poislim, and the chachomim say it's possible. It's the chachomim who say that if you don't have a clearly defined roof, it's not considered an oyhel. If so, Rav Yosef says, I'm following the chachomim. The chachomim not of the Mishnah. The chachomim as in the Braisa, which is the reverse of the Mishnah. So Abaye asked him, Shavkas masnisin v'avdas kabraisa, you're rejecting a Mishnah, where in the Mishnah, according to the Rabbanon, there would be an issue with this, and you're following the nusach, the formula of the Braisa, that says that according to the Chomim it's okay? Omerli, so Rav Yosef answered to Abaye, masnisin yichidohi, I've got a Braisa that made it clear to me that the text of our Mishnah is actually an individual opinion, that this is the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer, and this is the opinion of the Chachamim. The Tanya we learned in the Braisa, which is our Mishnah. Reb Nosson Omer, it's Reb Nosson who's the one who said that Rabbi Eliezer poisel, that Rabbi Eliezer is the one that says it's possible, no gag, because there's no roof, the Chachamim machshirim, and the Chachamim say it's kosher. But that was only Rabbi Eliezer, and that was only Reb Nosson who said that. So from the fact that it says Reb Nosson Omer, it seems that all the other Chachamim held that it wasn't Rabbi Eliezer poisel v'Chachamim machshirim. All the other majority of Chachamim held the other way around. Rabbi Eliezer machshirim and the Chachamim are poislim. The Chachamim are poislim because they say you need a roof. So to follow the majority opinion of the Chachamim, indeed, if you're in the kilas chasanim in the sukkah, you've been yet to the mitzvah of sukkah. Continues the next Mishnah. Machzeles konim gedoila. We're talking now about, this is a topic which we have to make sure not to get confused. We'll try not to get confused. There's machzeles are mats. And we've already learnt about this a little bit previously, that there's big mats and small mats. And mats can be made with one of three different intentions. Either it can be made in order to be schach. If you make a mat explicitly in order for it to be schach, then it's not a utensil, it's not going to be used, it's just for schach. And then it's not roy lekabel tuma, and it's kosher schach. If you make it explicitly to be able to sit on, to sleep on, to lie on, if so, it's utensil. It's roy lekabel tuma. It's posel schach. And then you can have a mat that was made stoma. I didn't actually give it much thought why I'm making it, why it's made. I'm just making a mat. It could be, it's not defined, and undefined. That's called stoma. Now, that everybody agrees. Something, if it was explicitly made for any reason, then we know what the halacha is. If it was made l'shchiva, which means to sleep, it's roy lekabel tuma, it's posel schach. If it's made l'sikuch for schach, it's kosher schach. Stoma is going to be a question. And there's going to be a difference, or there may be a difference, between stoma of a very big mat, and we already saw this previously, that the stoma of a big mat could well be that it's made l'sikuch, because you don't make such a big mat to lie on. And the stoma of a small mat would be to lie on, and therefore it would be roy lekabel tuma and not kosher schach. We have to try and see if this is what the Mishnah says and how. Machzeles konim gedoila. If you have a large mat of reeds, asa'ol l'shchiva, if you make it explicitly for shchiva to lie on, mekabeles tuma, it's roy lekabel tuma, ve'in masachin bo. We know there's a rule that anything which is roy lekabel tuma is posel for schach. L'sikuch. Now this is either, we're going to have to see soon how to read this, but either this means you made it explicitly for sikuch, or it means that if you didn't make it explicitly for shchiva and even stoma is included, then it's l'sikuch. And since it's l'sikuch, it's not a kli, it's not roy lekabel tuma, and masachim ba. You can use it for schach ve'eno mekabeles tuma. That's the opinion of the Tanna Kama. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Rabbi Eliezer says, achas ktano ve'achas gedoilo. that the Chachomim made it clear. Gedola, they didn't tell us about Ktana. We don't know anything about Ktana yet, according to the Chachomim. According to Rabbi Eliezer, they say no. Achas Ktana, Achas Gedola, they both have the same halacha, that asar l'shchiv, if you make it with the intentions of sleeping on it, mekabeles tumah, it's mekabel tumah, ve'in masachim ba. L'sikuch, we'll soon see whether this l'sikuch is stoma or not stoma, but l'sikuch, masachin ba, ve'in mekabeles tumah. If it's made with the intentions of using it for schach, it's not roy l'kabel tumah, it's kosher for schach. That's the Mishnah. Says the Gemara, ha gufa kashya. If let's first, the Gemara is going to now focus on the Chachomim. The Chachomim, they did mention Gedola, but let's put aside the word Gedola for a minute. Let's see what they said. They said, Asar l'shchiva, if you made it, and the basic reading would be, if you made it explicitly for shchiva, it's posel schach. L'sikuch, if you made it explicitly for schach, then it's kosher. And that seems to be a contradiction. I don't need to make it explicitly one and the other. It can either be explicitly for shchiva is posel, and then anything else, even if I don't do it explicitly for schach, will be kosher, or I need to do it explicitly for schach and then it will be kosher, and even if I don't do it explicitly for smicha, for shchiva, it's going to be posel. There seems to be a contradiction here. Gufa, how gufa kashya? Omros, first you say asar l'shchiva, you have to make it with intentions to sleep on it, mekabeles tumah ve'in mesachim ba. And we can deduce from that, Taima, the whole reason that it's posel schach is the asar l'shchiva, because you explicitly made it to sleep on. Ha'ostama, but if you made it with no explicit intention, then l'sikuch, we assume you made it for schach, and you can use it, it's kosher schach, even if you didn't have intentions explicitly for schach. V'hadar Tanya, and then you say the next line, l'sikuch, if you made it explicitly for schach, mesachin ba, then it's kosher schach, ve'inu mekabeles tumah. Time up, and we can deduce from there that the only reason it's kosher is the asar l'sikuch, because you made it explicitly for schach. Ha'ostama, if you didn't make it with any explicit intention, then l'shchiva, we assume you made it to sleep on, and it's posel schach. So we have a contradiction between the first statement and the second statement as to what's the halacha of stoma. So answers the Gemara, ha'loi kasha. This is not a question. We can answer it as follows. Kan b'gdoila, kan b'ktana. We're going to take the words of the Tanakama and we're going to sever them into two. We're going to say, we'll read it as follows. Machzeles konim gdoila, a large mat, asa'on l'shchiva, if you made it explicitly l'shchiva, then mekabeles tumah. Then it's mekabel tumah, ve'ein mesachim ba. And then we will indeed deduce from there that stoma, a gedola, if you make a big mat with no intention, with no explicit intention, it will be kosher schach. We assume you make it l'sikuch. That's it. We've finished talking about the gedola. And now, but a ktana, that's the next second half of the Tanakama. The ktana, l'sikuch, if you made it explicitly for schach, then mesachin ba, ve'inu mekabeles tumah. But a small mat that you don't make explicitly for schach, indeed the stoma, we assume you made it to sleep on, and it's posel schach. That is how the Gemara is learning the Chachomim. So then we see in the Chachomim, the Gedola is mentioned explicitly, the second part of their statement is Ktana, and we've answered the contradiction. We're going to have an issue now with Rabbi Eliezer. Because with Rabbi Eliezer, we have the same contradiction. He also says, Asar l'shchiva mekabeles tumah ve'in mesachim ba, l'sikuch mesachim ba ve'in mekabeles tumah. The problem is that Rabbi Eliezer says, Achas Ktana ve'achas Gedola. You can't split up. He says both Gedola and Ktana, the same thing applies. So you have a contradiction and you can't split them up and say one is part of the statements is Gedola, part is Ktana. He says explicitly it's the same. That's what the Gemara is now saying. Bishleim l'Rabbanon le'kashya. Okay, according to the Rabbanon, you've answered it. Elo l'Rebbe Eliezer kashya. According to Rabbi Eliezer, you still have the contradiction. Ditnan, because we saw in our Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, achas Ktana v'achas Gedola, both a small mat and a big one. Asar l'shchiva, if you did it explicitly l'shchiva, mekabeles tumah ve'in mesachim ba. And we deduce from there, tamid asar l'shchiva, it's only because you did it explicitly to sleep on. Ha'ostoma, but if you had no intentions the sikuch, then we can assume it's v'schach and it's kosher. A Masechet, take the second half of Rabbi Eliezer's statement. Asal sikuch, if you did it explicitly for schach, mesachin bo, then you could kosher schach. Ve'ena mekabeles tuma. But only time we deduce from there, that's only because the asal sikuch, you did it explicitly for schach. Ha stomach, if you had no explicit intention, the shchiva, we assume you did it to sleep on, and it's postel schach. We have a contradiction in Rabbi Eliezer with no way out of it. How you can't say ha gedola ha ketana. Answers the Gemara, Elo Amar Rava. So Rava says as follows. And the rule, what Rava's really doing now, is Rava's going to tell us now how to learn the Tanakama and Rabbi Eliezer. But the rule of what Rava is doing is he says every time it mentions the word sikuch in the Mishnah, it means stoma. So let's go, before we see Rava inside, let's go back, let's read the Mishnah. Masechet konim gedola, asar l'shchiva. If you did it explicitly to sleep on, mekabeles tuma. Then it's mekabel tuma, and ve'in mesachim bo. However, if you did it stoma is l'sikuch and mesachim bo. That the stoma, ve'in mekabeles tuma. Which means that stoma, by a big machzeles, is talking about gedola. Rava is not splitting up the Tanakama. The whole Tanakama is only gedola, and we see, and he learns that stoma is lesikuch, and that's all. That means it's not how we learned initially that asar l'shchiva means explicitly l'shchiva, lesikuch means explicitly lesikuch. No, asar l'shchiva means explicitly l'shchiva. Lesikuch means stoma. And then stoma is as if it was explicitly the sikuch, and it's kosher. And then we can deduce from there that the Tanakama are only speaking about gedola. They said machzeles konim gedola. What's with machzeles ktana? From there we deduce from there that from the fact that the Tanakama only spoke about gedola and not ktana is in order to impress on us that only by a gedola stoma is lesikuch, but by ktana stoma is not lesikuch. Stoma is leshchiva and it's posel schach. That's the opinion of the Tanakama. Rabbi Eliezer says no. Rabbi Eliezer says that achas ktano, achas gedola, that in the same way as by gedola, you Tanakama said that stoma is l'schach, Rabbi Eliezer hold that even by ktano, stoma is l'schach. That the ktano has the same status as gedola. Let's read Rabbi Eliezer in the Mishnah. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, achas ktano v'achas gedola, asar l'shchiva. If you did it explicitly l'shchiva, mekabeles toma ve'in masachin bo. However, stoma, both gedola and ktano, if you did it stoma, then we assume it's l'sikuch. We assume you did it for schach, masachin bo ve'in mekabeles toma. That is how Rava is going to read the Mishnah. Let's see this inside. Elo Amar Rava, b'gedola kule alma loy pligi, the stoma l'sikuch. Everyone agrees that in a big mat, stoma is l'sikuch. Ki pligi b'ktana, they're arguing by a small mat, is stoma l'sikuch or not. Tanakama sava, the Tanakama hold stam ktano l'shchiva. That since the Tanakama only said explicitly by gedola that stoma is l'sikuch, we assume that stam ktano is l'shchiva. Rabbi Eliezer sovar, stam ktano nami l'sikuch. That even by a small mat, the stoma is l'sikuch. V'hachi ka'omar. And now the Gemara is going to tell us how to read the Mishnah. So the Tanakama, machzeles konim gedola, a big mat, asar l'shchiva, mekabeles tuma ve'ein mesachkin bo. If you did it explicitly for shchiva, it's mekabel tuma, it's posel schach. Tama da asar l'shchiva. It's only because you did it explicitly l'shchiva. Ha stoma, but if you did it stoma, nase kamisha asar l'sikuch. So the words in the Tanakama l'sikuch means that stoma is l'sikuch and mesachim bo. And we deduce from there, it's in brackets in the Gemara, ktana. However, by ktana, which the Tanakama did not mention explicitly, and Rashi says here that we deduce it from the fact that the Tanakama only mentioned gedola, that ktana asar l'sikuch mesachin bo. If you did explicitly l'shem schach, it's obviously kosher. Taimed asar l'sikuch ha stoma, but by ktana, the stoma is nasa kamish asar l'shchiva ve'ein mesachin bo. That's the Tanakama. V'also Rabbi Eliezer l'meimer, Rabbi Eliezer says achas ktana ve'achas gedola. Not only a big mat, but also a small mat, stoma is ksheira l'sikuch. So that is how Rava learnt the Mishnah. Omar le Abaye. Abaye has an issue with this. If you're going to say that according to Rava, what Rabbi Eliezer meant to say was that the status of a stoma, of a small mat, is like the big mat, then Rabbi Eliezer oimer achas ktana v'achas gedola v'achas ktana miboile. The words achas ktana v'achas gedola, which is the term that Rabbi Eliezer uses in the Mishnah, seems to be that the achas ktana v'achas gedola means that the Gemara seems to understand that it means that the big mat is like the small mat. Not only achas ktana, not only the small one, but even achas gedola, even the big one, is like the small mat. But according to how we're saying now, that Rabbi Eliezer means to say that the small mat is like the big one, it should say achas gedola v'achas ktanum. It should say that not only the big one, but also the small one has the same status as the big one. It's the wrong way around. V'oid, another question on the way Rava understood this. Ki pligi, we'll soon see, but ki pligi b'gdola. We're soon going to see that the whole machlekes Rabbi Eliezer and Tanna Kama is with a big mat, not with a small mat. According to the way Rava explained it, the machlekes is by the small mats. We're going about to see in a brisa that the machlekes is by big mats, where the stoma is lesikuch and is kosher, or stoma is la shchiva and is posel. And Rabbi Eliezer is machmir. Rabbi Eliezer is going to say that the stoma is chumra is l'shchiva. The Tanya we saw in the brisa. Machzeles hakonim. We've already seen this brisa on Daf Tezayin. Machzeles hakonim. If you have a mat of reeds, begdoila mesachin bo. A big mat, you're allowed to use it for schach. Rabbi Eliezer says im eino mekabeles tuma. That if you explicitly had in mind the sikuch, then it's not mekabel tuma and mesachim bo. However, if you didn't explicitly have in mind the schach, the stoma is, in a big mat, he's talking about a gdoila, that the stoma is l'shchiva and is posel. So the Tanna Kama say in the brayse, machzeles konim b'gdoila mesachim bo, if you have a mat stoma, you're allowed to use it. It's kosher. We assume that stoma is l'sikuch by a big mat. Rabbi Eliezer says no. Only im eino mekabeles tuma if you had explicitly in mind l'shem sikuch. So you see in the brayse clearly that they're not arguing at all by the status of stoma with a small mat. And we'll soon see that with a small mat, they both hold, Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachomim hold, that stoma is l'shchiva and is posel. It's only if you have explicitly in mind it should be the schach that it's kosher schach. On a big mat, that's the machlekas. That the Tanna Kama say that stoma is kosher. Rabbi Eliezer says that just like the small mat is stoma is l'shchiva, so too by the big mat, stoma is l'shchiva. That's what's going to come out. And then it's indeed that the big mat has the same status as a small mat. And if so, we can understand why it says achas ktano v'achas gdoila. Not only a small mat, stoma is l'shchiva, a big mat also. The question is, how are we going to learn the Mishnah this way? El Omer of Papa is going to explain as follows. Biktano kule alma loy pligi de stoma l'shchiva, as we just said, the small mat stoma is l'shchiva and is posel. Ki pligi, where's Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachomim arguing? B'gdoila with a big mat. Tanna Kama sovar stam gdoila l'sikuch. The stoma by a big mat is l'sikuch. Rabbi Eliezer sovar stam gdoila nami l'shchiva. Umay asao l'shchiva. De ka'omar hochi ka'omar stam asiyasa nami l'shchiva ad ovid l'sikuch. So before we see this again inside, what Rav Papa is saying is follows. Rav Papa is saying, you want to understand the Tanna Kama, we're taking you back to the very first explanation that the Gemara had before we asked the steer in Rabbi Eliezer. The Gemara said that we had a contradiction in the Chachomim. Is it l'shchiva is posel schach but stoma is kosher, and then it says l'sikuch is kosher schach but stoma is posel. How did the Gemara explain it? We cut it into two. The first half is speaking about a big mat. The second half is speaking about a small mat. The first half is saying l'shchiva, if you did it explicitly to sleep on, it's posel schach. Stoma is kosher schach. So stoma by a big mat, according to the Chachomim, is kosher. The second half is saying, if you did it explicitly l'sikuch, then it's kosher schach. But stoma is not kosher, that's talking about a small mat. So the Tanna Kama we're going to learn is like the Gemara learned initially. Rabbi Eliezer is then saying, echos ktana ve'echos gdoila. What that means is, or he actually says, achas ktan ve'achas gdoila, what he's saying is that in the same way as you Chachomim said, that by a small mat, you have to do it explicitly l'sikuch, and stoma is l'shchivan is possible, we say the same by a big mat. And how are we reading that into Rabbi Eliezer? Let's see the Gemara again. Rabbi Eliezer sova stam gedoylo nami l'shchiva. Umay asor l'shchiva de ka'omar. So when Rabbi Eliezer says that asor l'shchiva, then it's mekabeles tuma. Now we're saying that not only if asor l'shchiva, but even stoma, it's possible. Hochi ka'omar. Stam asiyasa, if you didn't do it l'sikuch, then the stoma is that nami l'shchiva, and it's also as if you intended to do it l'shchiva, ad ovid l'sikuch, and the only time it's kosher schach, both by a big mat and a small mat, is ad ovid l'sikuch, when you explicitly did it with the intentions of using it for schach. And in the next shiur, we're going to continue from here.